it's a great call today with a number of guests that we had a previous call to give an overview of the project with, really focusing on the relevant electric retail regulatory authority perspective. But I wanted to introduce Katie Teresa, who is our Vice President of External Affairs and Government Relations, just to give a welcome to this group across all of these different stakeholders. So Katie, if you hear me?
Yes, and thanks, Eric, for giving me the opportunity to give the welcome and say good day to this next session where we'll have ISOs, RTOs, utilities, regulators together to talk about the challenges and opportunities with FERC Order 2222. So before I came to EPRI, I spent a couple of years at the Department of Energy in charge of transmission permitting, state technical assistance, and transmission congestion studies. So I'm all too familiar with many of the complexities and stakeholders that are involved with the transmission space. So I was thinking, you know, when Eric had this, that I would just love to say welcome, and I think this is a great opportunity for us to get together in this virtual room across the country and really express my appreciation to the commissioners who are here and also the other representatives throughout our industry. I mean, we've got great representation going from Massachusetts to California and in the heart of the country, Kentucky and Arkansas, and I just really appreciate you being here. So as we know, FERC 2222 is one of the most impactful orders that FERC has in FERC history. I've been doing this for about 15 years, and I think that it really is going to make a broad and deep impact to our industry. And I look forward to the discussion, hearing the discussions today. It's just so important with the many different perspectives and responsibilities that we have. Every type of discussion.
As a reminder, in case new folks are joining the call, and then our schedule. So today's, and we've got, you know, some upcoming webcasts on the biweekly schedule for the next few Thursdays. And while we're doing this, I am going to open up a poll for folks to respond to, and I'll just get into some of what what some of the questions are in just a second, but I want to open it up so folks can respond to that as we're talking here. So we don't have any upcoming workstream calls, and we'll start those up again. Most of the workstreams are working on some of the deliverables, but we'll make sure that folks get those invitations for the workstreams specific activities as they come up. Probably in May, we'll pick those back up again. And then just some of the upcoming biweekly webcast topics. On May 6th, we'll have a distribution utility panel to talk about the override discussions and some other discussions. Also, upcoming panel with third-party aggregators, some NERC activities. We'll finish up our educational sessions with the 201 courses, and then double counting and some other research topics that we'll have on future agenda as well. One thing I wanted to bring up, most of you are familiar with, is that there's a new tongue twister, Order 2222 due in 2022. And hope everyone can say that 5 times fast. So PJM, MISO, and SDP have extended their compliance filings, and FERC has approved to February and April of next year. ISO New England has submitted that as well. And you know, there's obviously impacts on this. It'll allow for greater participation within each of the RTOs and stakeholder discussions. It does have an impact on our project in some ways. We did set this project up with a pretty aggressive timeline to try to get some deliverables in before, with enough time before the July compliance filings to provide some good information for folks. And so, you know, we're looking to see feedback on, given that these extensions have happened, should we continue the project timeline as is? Should we extend some of the webcast discussions into the fall? you know, maybe have our deliverables as planned, but then have updates in the fall, maybe even slow down the rate of the webcasts to make sure that, you know, there's sufficient funding to make these continue throughout the fall. There's a couple poll questions on there. Just want to get some feedback from folks on what you think would be best to do. And feel free to reach out to us also after the fact. A few folks have already responded to one of the emails that we sent last week on some feedback there as well. But we're just looking at some thoughts on is there differences that we should do in terms of the different timelines. So today's agenda, so as Katie mentioned, we have some great guests with us today. Several commissioners will be participating, and senior staff really across all, within representatives across all the FERC jurisdictional ISOs. So we have a great representation here from the relevant Electric Retail Regulatory Authority. We also have Marcus Hawkins from the Organization of MISO States, and sorry for the typo there, Tomas Rodriguez from OPSI, who will help moderate the panel session, and that'll go for about the next 50 minutes. And then we'll save the last 30 minutes for a facilitated Q&A to kind of get some, you know, immediate responses from ISOs and RTOs, as well as from distribution utilities, and sort of hopefully a little bit of a back and forth. I know that's hard to do. We've got close to 200 people on the call already, but you know, I think that we can try to use some of the WebEx functions, chat, raise hand feature, et cetera, to have some good dialogue. And before I hand it off to Marcus and Tomas to introduce the panel and some of the objectives of the panel, I think it's useful to show some of the relevant pieces of Order 2222 as part of this discussion. And so FERC did require each RTO and ISO to specify in its tariff how it will accommodate and incorporate the voluntary involvement of relevant electric retail regulatory authorities in the coordination and participation of DER aggregations in RTO ISO markets. And some of the examples are there that FERC actually provided, not an exhaustive list, but some of the things that in some of the comments that were provided in the original filings and what might potentially be that role. And then we've started to discuss in some of our coordination discussions what some of those roles would be and how they would interact as part of the coordination. So something to think about, and we'll hear more about this from our panelists, and then of course within the Q&A discussion. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Marcus and Tomas for the panel, and like I said, we'll have about 50 minutes for the panel, and you know, we'll have clarifying questions and such on the chat. But really looking forward to this. Over to you, Marcus and Tomas.
Thank you, Eric. As you said, my name is Marcus Hawkins. I'm with the Organization of MISO States, and I'm going to be leading us through our panelists here. As Eric said, we had a great group from all over the country join us this afternoon, and we are the new perspective to the party. The EPRI project has been going on for a number of months, and I believe this is your first event with the regulators involved. So purpose of today's discussion is to really hear what's going on in all of the regions, what the regulators are thinking about, what their concerns are, how they're interacting with their ISOs, and all of that good stuff. So I'm going to keep it simple, and we're just going to go from east to west across the country and hear what's going on. So I'm going to turn it over first to Sheila Keene, who is the Acting Deputy of Communications and External Affairs at the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities. So,
and Marcus, if I can just jump in 1 second and give the heads up that I'll be tracking time. I think we said shoot for around 7 minutes, so I'll give a 1 minute warning.
Perfect. We got to move through quick. We have a limited window here. So Sheila, what is going on in Massachusetts and New England?
Hey, thanks, Marcus. It's great to see you and everyone else here. I will try to be quick and brief in my remarks because I'm interested to get to the discussion and far less interested to hear myself speak. So I'm hoping I don't even need the 1 minute warning, but we'll see how we do. So a lot's going on in New England. We are, tiny but mighty. We're 6 states up in the Northeast. And to prove we have a sense of humor, we've actually requested our compliance due date to be on February 2nd in 2222, so 2222. But I think, I wanted to spend a few minutes just talking from a Massachusetts perspective about 2 pieces of Order 2222 that we're thinking a lot about. I think when we think about it, there's really 2 things. It highlights some of the ongoing issues and challenges we're seeing with the increasing amounts of distributed generation coming on our system. And then it adds an extra layer of complexity with the aggregation. So just some brief information about Massachusetts. We have some pretty ambitious clean energy goals. So we've committed to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050, and also committed to going to net zero by 2050. And as part of our efforts to do that, we've spent a lot of time and energy in really successfully supporting the deployment of distributed generation across our state. And that has been really successful. We've seen a lot of solar, and we're seeing a lot more solar and storage co-located facilities, and in fact, increasingly standalone storage as well coming on our distribution system. And so while that's wonderful, I think what we've seen is a lot of focus on our interconnection process, because we've really gotten to the point where we have so much distributed generation on our system that it's having cumulative impacts on the transmission system. So at least in Massachusetts, we've had a bit of a crash course with ISO New England in learning how the distributed generation on our distribution system that comes through our state interconnection process starts to impact ISO New England, and we have needs for transmission studies, and that's been a really big learning curve for us. And so, in Massachusetts, these complex transmission and distribution studies are the new normal for our interconnecting customers. And these customers are facing pretty significant upgrades just to connect to the system, right? And this is absent aggregation. It's just what's been happening in Massachusetts. So at the DPU, we're really we've opened an investigation not only into our interconnection process, but also into cost allocation, and are there different ways to kind of share the costs that would allow some of these upgrades to get built to enable more DG to come online. And I think, we felt really good about our interconnection process up until 2 years ago, maybe, where we had a standard process across the state. We have a technical standards review group. We allow group study in our state, so you can have multiple projects studied at once. We have a DG ombudsperson to help with dispute resolution. And so that was a really strong grounding for us going into Order 2222, but I think we still have some concerns about how it could potentially impact our interconnection process, what dispute resolution looks like under Order 2222. And so those are things we're thinking about in the back of our mind. And I think the thing that, at least for me, kind of not worries me, but the area where I see the biggest challenge for Order 2222 for us is really the back office stuff, like the infrastructure and software that's going to need to support the communications, the billings, the metering, all of that, because, we expect as the regulator that cost recovery is going to come before us. And, part of our role is not just safety or reliability, but it's really consumer cost protection and thinking about those costs and benefits there.
Awesome. One question I had that just popped into my mind on that interconnection study with ISO New England, when you started to experience the transmission system issues, has that now evolved into a formal process, or is it still kind of like a one-off ad hoc evaluation from the RTO?
Yeah, so because it is really driven by the cumulative impact of distributed generation on the system, once you kind of hit that threshold at, let's say, the substation, you're really kind of, any interconnecting customer is probably going to have to be part of that transmission study. So we've been working really closely with ISO, and I don't know if anyone from ISO is on the phone, but I really have to commend them and their staff for really kind of rolling up their sleeves and sitting down at the table with us. They had a crash course in our interconnection process, and we had a crash course in theirs. And so it is, we've issued some orders kind of, at least on our end, formalizing expectations for interconnecting customers, kind of working on improving communication so that customers know, where the ISO touches, where a transmission owner is involved, where a distribution company is involved, to kind of more clearly spell that out, because it was like 2 sentences in our interconnection tariff originally, because it just was never an issue before.
Yeah.
So.
Very interesting. That's something I know we've been working on, and I won't steal Tricia's thunder, but we've been thinking about that in MISO land. So anything else or any questions coming in for Sheila and for understanding what's going on in Massachusetts or New England? Otherwise, I think we're pretty close to time. Here we go. We have a question coming in. Do you have any estimated costs, or have you started looking at those back office changes for billing and metering and those coordination tools? Have you started to?
We don't have estimates. I think some of it's really going to be driven by what shape the final compliance takes. And so I think that's, one of the reasons that ISO had requested an extension was specifically to kind of dig more into the metering challenges, or, how that actually gets implemented on the ground. I will say it dovetails with a lot of other work that we're doing at the state level. I'm sure many other states here are going through grid modernization proceedings, and there's a whole suite of investments you could choose to approve in those. And, is it going to be driven by Order 2222 compliance or by something else? So we're, it's kind of a meeting of the worlds on that one.
And that's where the cost allocation fund comes in that you mentioned earlier as well.
The cost allocation fund is just to get the projects interconnected. We're doing that regardless of Order 2222.
Okay.
If that went away tomorrow, we've still got to figure out, infrastructure challenges of getting distributed generation online in our state.
And Marcus, this is Tomas and Sheila. We have couple other questions, but we are also around the 1 minute mark. So Brendan Lowe wanted to know if you could provide a couple examples of what types of disputes you were referring to, and then if you could maybe address the second one as well. The second question coming from Emma Rodvain is, how is the DPU thinking about leveraging AMI and other information services deployed for other purposes, like a grid mod program, for instance, for Order 2222?
Yeah, so I could take those very quickly, and then I want to make sure I give others time to speak. So in terms of dispute resolution, our interconnection tariff has a dispute resolution process built into it, where if a developer is interconnecting and running into what they see as challenges or issues with the distribution company, there's a formal process for them to follow that also involves our DG ombuds person as kind of a third party to help mediate some of that. So there's kind of a prescriptive process in place, and then she also helps with informal disputes too before it gets to the formal dispute process. And just in terms of AMI and other information services, that's a great question. We currently have an open investigation into grid mod, so I can't say too much about it, other than, having Order 2222 compliance built into it is just another layer of something that we're going to have to consider when we look at the costs and benefits of the different investments that are going to be proposed to us.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Sheila. We will move along now on our journey west, and next stop is New York, where we have Chairman Howard with us. Good afternoon, Chairman Howard, and I believe we also have Marco Padula. Sorry if I butchered that last name, but I noticed in Eric's implementation timeline, New York is one of the places that didn't request an extension and is going to comply by July. So interested to hear what is going on in New York.
Thank you very much. And as you said, I'm joined today by Marco Padula, our Director of Markets and Innovations at the department. I must admit, I am somewhat of a rookie, having been now chairman for 6-8 weeks, and been on the commission less than 2 years. So the issues of complexity fly at me, as I know all my colleagues around the country, every day by the bucketful. But those that don't know, New York, we have now a statutory mandates on decarbonization. Our first goal is 70% by 2030 of non-emission sources, and then 100% by 2040. And we believe, and I believe personally that we need all of the above solutions in order to get us there. We have been dealing with the distributed energy resources now for quite a long time, and our resource base is growing tremendously. And along with the mandates for decarbonization, we also have mandates on solar, both in large baseload solar and as distributed solar, as well as storage, that are all statutory mandates now. So our grid is probably going under its most exciting and challenging transformation since electricity was invented. And we're not unique in that, but we do believe we are way far ahead. And clearly, we believe in New York that distributed resources will play an important and quite honestly necessary role, from solar, demand response, energy storage, other distributed resources, again, with the goals of reducing emissions and keeping system reliability at peak. And how do we, I think the big part of this order is, how do we maximize value at all levels from distributed energy resources? And we have been engaged in that hunt and that process from day one, particularly with an eye toward how do we maximize customer benefits at the end of the day. Because we all know that this energy transition is going to be quite expensive. And how we maximize each one of the components on the benefit of customers is vital to that. Under FERC Order 2222, this just helping facilitate this integration rules is just I believe, a complement to what we're already doing on the levels. And necessity of aggregating the very small inputs will be critical in getting our process going. But how you do that is the rub, and particularly those issues that my colleagues from Massachusetts said we've all faced right from the beginning, from AMI integration to cost allocations, and the queuing of DER resources onto the grid, which has been at fits and starts, but we do believe we're on a process to make it far better than we have. And our own experience is what gets us there. And our collaboration with the New York RTO, I believe, has been tremendous, not only on this issue, a whole variety of issues going forward. They are truly partners in this decarbonization effort, and we really can't separate ourselves from them. And but part of the difficulty of going first is getting it right first, and that will be challenging. And we will make our July filing deadline, right, Marco? And that's that. But again, I just need to view this as in the context, while an important initiative is just one of many initiatives that we need to do simultaneously. Building small, and finally integrating them so the system works reliably. I think one of the mantras that, since I have been on the commission and certainly as been chair, is system reliability and efficiency is our number one not goal, but mission, both statutorily and I believe morally, and how we fit this DER integration, maximizing its benefits for customers and developers, for that matter, is paramount. So that's where we are. And Marco, do you have anything to add?
I would just emphasize the maximizing benefits to customers, and that's really dual participation, having the distributed resources provide distribution benefits to the fullest extent possible, and also maximize the wholesale side of the benefits that the same resources can provide to the wholesale market. So I think that's key, and really a big reason to do the aggregation and want to see the resources being able to do the dual participation, for sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the update. I think we are trending a little bit behind. So unless there is a question, Tomas, we might just move to the next. I haven't seen anything.
Yeah, I'm not seeing anything in the chat, Marcus.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Chairman Howard and Marco. We will move next to Kentucky, where we're joined by Vice Chairman Chandler. And what is going on in Kentucky and the PJM region? Interested to hear what's going on next door to my neck of the woods.
Yeah, well, it's April, so we're racing horses in Kentucky right now. But we've got plenty to do in PJM, that's for sure. So I will try to be short, as short as possible, because I would like to hear what the other panelists have to say. As opposed to others, we do not have a sense of humor in PJM. Instead of asking for our compliance filing date to be February 2nd next year, we chose it to be February 1st. But we did get that extension from FERC the other day. We in PJM, our state group, OPSI, has 14 jurisdictions, 13 states, and the District of Columbia. We created a Order 2222 work group chaired by myself and New Jersey President Joe Friordaliso fairly early on, and then subsequently created a OPSI PJM Order 2222 work group. Internally with OPSI, we've met, I think, 6 or 7 times with with stakeholders or just amongst ourselves, and then we've met another 5 times with that OPSI PJM Order 2222 work group. I think we kind of put it on a hiatus, given we knew we expected to get the extension, and we are also working on a couple of other what we believe to be important topics in PJM that take a bit of precedent over it. But the other day, PJM did come out with a straw proposal on implementing Order 2222 that I think will really get the conversation going. I would run through that straw proposal, but I think it was 95 slides. So I'll spare everybody and tell them they can go to the PJM website. PJM has been holding a ton of meetings. I think at this point they've held more than a dozen meetings on this issue. So I think they're trying to move pretty fast, at least to get this initial straw proposal out in front of folks and trying to get some feedback. But I'm glad they're making it a priority, I guess I would say. And I think the states are too. We, with 14 different jurisdictions, we have some very, very different retail regulation amongst those 14 jurisdictions. And I think it's good to find that almost every jurisdiction at this point is pretty involved and pretty interested in this topic, whether it's wanting to see specific outcomes or concerned about certain effects. So here in Kentucky, I'll just say, probably won't be surprised to some people, we're a little behind on a couple of these things. We are certainly behind places like Massachusetts with the smart grids, the meters that they may have. We have a fairly low penetration of distributed resources right now. We have a state net metering program, not particularly popular. Either way, our state legislature has decided to change net metering. And so we were already, as a state, having to take a new look at distributed energy resources anyways. And we're planning on taking a pretty strong look at changing or updating our interconnection guidelines, at least for net metering DERs. And so we already had an open docket, or just opened a docket to look at those interconnection guidelines for net metering. And so we've sort of co-opted it to look at both net metering and 2222 DER interconnections. We actually just, I think 2 days ago, got a first round of briefs from involved participants in that docket. We specifically asked them to discuss current and reasonably anticipated issues or concerns identified with net metering interconnection guidelines or FERC Order 2222. Every state's going to be different. We have mostly small utilities in Kentucky. We only have 4 large investor-owned utilities, 19 distribution cooperatives that we regulate, and 2 G&Ts. Only one of those 19 co-ops is probably going to meet the 4 million megawatt, you know, the above the small utility definition, I guess is what I'd say. So it's effectively going to be possibly that one co-op and then the others. And so, you know, we're looking at how that will apply across those different types of utilities, the different landscape. They all have varying levels of what I would call smart grid investment. And I thought it would be helpful to point out a couple of things that folks had mentioned in those initial briefs. One of the things was override capability. And with the override capability was how much insight they actually have in real time to their system. One of the items that was noted is that the majority of the distribution systems in Kentucky are not currently built to handle the information necessary to have significant amounts of DERs. These are either quotes or paraphrase from these briefs. That our utilities have very little two-way monitoring, and those utilities that do have two-way monitoring, that communication is not tied to SCADA. That many or most of our utilities lack adequate communications technologies to automate real-time monitoring. Without that real-time monitoring, it's even further impossible or tougher to take real-time actions in operating a distribution system. And any action that is taken has to be manually done instead of automated. And then I think there's a lot of concern about voltage and amp issues. You know, there was identification that none of the voltage regulators effectively on our systems are set up for bidirectional power flows. So, you know, it's a concern around operation. It's a concern around reliability. And then stemming from those, it seems to be a significant concern around cost. And I think there's an expectation that at least historically in Kentucky with net metering, you can account for much of the costs up front in the interconnection. I think there's a concern that as additional DERs come online, there's going to be costs that are driven by the fact that there's a 20th DER on a line, and how do you account for the cost that may have been you know, accumulating over time for those, you know, first 19. So.
Awesome.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Chandler. Tomas Rodriguez here. We are just getting into the 1 minute warning, but I do see a quick question for you through the chat, and I can't tell you who it's from. It says from 3840, but it asks, when do you think the OPSI working group is going to publicly provide comments to the PJM STRUP proposal?
I don't know, Tomas, have you started working on those? I guess it's when we get a chance to, I think, probably get our focus back onto the Order 2222 implementation. I think that it'll probably take a backseat for the next few weeks while we're dealing with some other stuff, including on the capacity reforms.
I tend to agree with you there, Vice Chairman Chandler. And, you know, sometimes it's kind of hard for all of the 14 jurisdictions to land on a clear message to send back to stakeholders. So we're doing our best. But I think that's about it that I see here in the chat, unless you wanted any final thoughts.
That's great. Thank you.
All right. Well, I'll allow Marcus to take us from here.
Thank you, Tomas. We will next go to the best part of the country, the MISO land, occupying the large middle of America, where we will hear from Tricia DeBleeker, who is with the Minnesota Public Utility Commission and heads up a ton of the DER-related efforts going on both at OMS and at MISO. So take it away, Tricia.
Thanks, Marcus. So I'm Tricia DeBleeker with the Minnesota PUC. I'm going to few key actions from essentially our regulator collective OMS, and then the organization of MISO states, and then I'm going to touch on some of what we are doing in Minnesota to essentially prepare for some of this DER integration. So regarding the organization of MISO states, I think first, back in 2016 when this order the rulemaking first came out and we were looking at it, we had some really forward-thinking regulators at that point. I'm looking at Ted Thomas right now. Who believed who really thought that making DERs a strategic priority of the OMS leadership was necessary due to the unique state and federal jurisdictional issues. And so throughout the last 4 to 5 years, OMS has continued to keep that DER integration as a strategic priority falling from that, what we did was we worked with our RTO and MISO to develop essentially joint priorities between the regulator and our RTO. Those were really focused on education, coordination, and information sharing, as well as encouraging the adoption of IEEE 1547. Falling from that, what we also did with that was we worked with MISO to create essentially joint educational workshops that were released in a series of 100, 200, and 300 that really helped bring our stakeholders up to speed on DERs, both on their opportunities and their challenges in our region. I think that was a real win, both for our regulator sphere, our stakeholder sphere, and then also to bring the conversation to MISO. So speaking to our Minnesota state action and how our commission is preparing, I think it's important to note up front that Minnesota and our commission has been preparing for, but also experiencing an increase in DER penetration for several years. So it's not really what we're doing in response to 2222. We've just had a large community solar garden penetration in our state. And so these actions that our state have taken isn't necessarily in response to 2222, but it's enabled us and set us up really well to continue that work. I think first, what we did back in 2015 was we established a grid mod investigation that really laid the groundwork. A stated intention of that investigation was to ensure that the commission had the opportunity to work and learn from both stakeholders and our utilities regarding what was coming down the pike, what options and what issues the commission should pursue, or whether what's best left to our utilities and stakeholders. One of the resulting kind of streams of work was we established integrated distribution system planning in our state. That planning and that process that we created essentially established the space and the place to look at distribution system planning, the needs for the system, the cost of system upgrades, what technology are looked at as alternatives. And so it's really covering a wide scope of what we can see and use from what's coming out of FERC Order 2222. We'll have a space to discuss that. As for interconnection, our commission recently updated our interconnection standards. A key aspect of that, which I found was really useful, is that it created a community in our state that already talks about interconnection standards. It also created a forum to adapt to change, because we know those standards went into place before 2222 was released, but we also knew that change was coming. And so that was built, this kind of iterative process was built into that. I think regarding essentially like grid customer data and like the registration processes that Order 2222 touches on, I think we're touching on some of those issues in our states really in one-off dockets, but like a speaker had just said from EPRI in our previous call, there's a lot of commonality between those issues within each of our state. They're not really unique. And so to the extent there are lessons learned that we can take from other states, I think all of our states are really watching for that. And learning both what's possible, but also what shouldn't be done. And so to the extent we can kind of use and help streamline some of these actions and steps our states need to take, I know we're interested in doing that. And so last, I want to make two plugs here. I can't not use the space to do this. I think first, educating your regulators is really important. Bring them along in this conversation. I don't want any of our states or our regulated entities to be the final or unnecessary roadblock to implementing a lot of these changes that are coming. And so making sure you're bringing your regulator along, I think, is really important. And then second, it's just a personal issue, but it's the staffing levels across PUCs. I think the amount, the scope, and the new types of issues and technology that we're being asked to regulate and the pace of work and change, it's already having an effect in our state with some of the increased DER penetration issues, but I really do think we're only just getting started. So I'll leave that with my two little plugs. If I can answer any questions if anyone has any for either OMS or Minnesota.
Well, I know when talking to Vice Chairman Chandler earlier, he would absolutely agree with your last point there as well, and hearing some of the struggles with keeping up with what's going on over in PJM and just keeping up to speed. But I had one question on the interconnection work that's been going on in Minnesota. You said it's looking forward to build in some flexibility, and that goes to what Eric was saying at the prior call about restudying if it's for a new or unintended use from the original interconnection. I know I've talked with Chair Thomas about this before, but what are you guys thinking about in building in that flexibility?
So I think more it's that we have the right people talking, and we already have this group set up. There's the pieces in place to do it. You don't have to like start from the ground up to essentially make the changes. You know your stakeholder community, you know the group. And so I think that's where it really makes the changes easier. And then additionally, we have an ongoing distributed generation work group that tackles some of these, these updates and these issues that essentially weren't contemplated. And so then how do you build those back in and what do you need to change? And so that's really what I meant by like essentially like a change management option.
Got it. And on the distribution system planning side of things, there's assumptions that go into that as far as, what changes might be needed. Is that intended to kind of like head off that incremental issue that Commissioner Chandler was referring to, where like all of a sudden an issue pops up, so you're kind of looking out and getting ahead of that, or what's sort of the focus?
So with the distribution system planning, what we were able to do is essentially establish requirements by order. And so in rulemaking, if you had your rules set, you'd really be stuck with that set of provisions. And so we were able to work with our stakeholders or our utilities to essentially say, there are pieces of this we don't need anymore. It was a one-time thing we needed to know this year, but moving forward, we can focus on some of these other pieces that are essentially adapting and changing. And so that's what's really giving us that flexibility in the planning sphere.
And this might be a time to just say we're probably about at a minute or less.
Okay. Any questions for Tricia? I don't see any in the chat. We have 2 speakers left, and so I think we're probably best to keep on moving along on our voyage west here. Thank you, Tricia. Next, we will go to Chairman Thomas of the Arkansas Commission, who is involved in the work going on in the SPP region. So, Chair Thomas, what is going on in Arkansas and SPP?
Thank you, Marcus. First of all, and I'd also like to thank Chair Balk of the Wisconsin Commission. I apologize for being late, and the one that helped me figure out my schedule, which that shouldn't happen from 1,500 miles away, but it did. In SPP, first of all, we're relieved by the time extension. This is a lot, and we're basically trying to chew through the minimum requirements of the order and have a tariff that's in compliance and defer policy questions that can't meet that timeline. So we're basically, and I'm not surprised at all, the person, Michael DeSell of SPP, who's leading the effort, has a military background because we are on a military kind of schedule. In terms of the most important impact, I know that Sheila and Kent both referenced this communication infrastructure and protocols. To me, the lasting impact of 2222 will likely be that. And while I agree with Commissioner Christie's concern about cost, why I disagree with his dissent is because, yes, this will cost money, but it's building infrastructure necessary for this technology. If you look at technology as a tree, we're pretty close to the bottom of the tree when we're looking at this new technology. And if you saw it off right now by not doing these investments, not only do you use the potential of the existing technology, any technology in the future that might develop out of these technologies is also lost. So if you want to have these kinds of distributed options, you have to invest in the infrastructure so that these new operators on the system are capable of communicating with the utility and the RTO. In terms of the strategic things that we're thinking about, or that I'm thinking about, when you think about load, when you think about DR aggregation, are we talking about a load reduction in the incumbent utility service territory only? Or are we talking about the ability of an aggregation in one area to serve as a resource in another area, and the transmission issues pertaining to that as well? To me, there's an approach difference that has to be sorted out, and it's complex. And that relates to another issue, is how do you make sure that if you want third parties aggregating, not just the utility, how do you make sure that their resources are treated equally? If the utility does an aggregation, an RTO is like a potluck. Everybody's got to bring something to the potluck. you know that in that RTO calculation, if the utility brings it to the table, that they're going to get credit. When you have a third party, how do you make sure that they get an equivalent credit? Does a third party, does there have to be an IRP kind of thing, a resource contract kind of thing? How do you level the playing field? And to me, the third parties are very important. We want them in the mix for the entrepreneurial aspect. What an entrepreneur does is they test demand. We really don't have that much interaction with customers and their usage. We don't know how much demand there is for that. We need entrepreneurs to test that demand and do so with their own money as the third parties. But we also, to me, you need the utilities in there too. They're customers. And I've told this to my co-op folks. Nobody cares about those co-op folks more than you. Let's have these entrepreneurs test demand. If they find some, we know that you care about everybody in your service territory, that you're not going to cherry pick for the best customers. So how do you sort those issues out? See, it's kind of one big issue. How do you sort those issues out? To me, is very important in how you do this. The second strategic issue that's very important is the double counting issue. You want everybody to get paid for what they bring to the grid once, not twice. But at the same time, we don't want double counting provisions to be used by potential market competing parties as a barrier to the new technologies. Of course, this is where it ties into the jurisdiction, and y'all know I'm going to talk about jurisdiction when we talk, because that's just how I roll. The DC, although the 222 order told the RTOs, put some of your tariff about double counting. To me, the ultimate hammer on double counting is the DC Circuit in the storage order, which is the jurisdictional basis of 2222, said that a state could condition participation on a retail program, make it a condition not to participate in the federal program. To me, that gives states the ultimate authority over double counting. We don't think the feds are doing it right. You can say, okay, if you're going to participate in our retail program, you can't participate in the wholesale program. So there needs to be work between the states and the RTO on double counting the way there is on transmission planning, because the states have ultimate authority on certification, even though the RTO does the planning. But that's why they work with us, because it doesn't get approved if we don't do the certification. Now, the DC Circuit rule that said that is, to me, very important. And this is why, I don't oppose the opt-out standing alone. But what eviscerated, in my view, the opt-out was the DC Circuit opinion that gave the states the authority to condition participation in a retail program and not participating in the wholesale, which to me, in jurisdictional terms, that is more valuable than the opt-out. And here is why. In the EPSA case, the Supreme Court case on the demand response program, the Supreme Court of the United States held that a practice affecting wholesale rates could be a retail rate. That FERC could set a retail rate if it was a practice affecting wholesale rates. And that concept extended too far would eviscerate state jurisdiction. The DC Circuit ruling, in my view, protects us from that illogical result by stating in black and white that the state can condition participation in a retail program and not participating in a wholesale, which protects state jurisdiction from the potential abuse of viewing a retail rate practice affecting a wholesale rate. And for that reason, I will be filing comments that support the FERC's view. I would also note that we had an application in my state for a demand response program that was opposed by utilities at MISO. It was made more complex at the state level, so we have two regulatory proceedings. a MISO protest of protest of a MISO filing on demand response made it 3 federal proceedings. So the Voltus company, which wanted to sell demand response to Walmart in Arkansas, filed the complaint that says, hey, if you have an opt-out on demand response, but you don't have an opt-out on storage, what are you going to do if I got a storage device and I want to use a demand response? So the complaint that got filed that places the opt-out at risk wasn't because the state wanted to opt out. It's because I'm beating my head against a litigation rock because I want to opt in. And that has created the destruction of the opt-out, in my humble opinion, because Voltus has a complaint pending here and they got combat litigation technique practiced against them. So they went to the FERC and lined up a headshot on the whole state opt-out. Got to play these things smart.
Chairman Thomas,
So that's what I think about
just interject. You are running up against time, so just wanted to warn you.
Thank you, and I'm done at that point.
All right. Well, I want to give you compliments for the imagery. Again, the new tree pruning imagery is probably I remember years ago we used to talk about the bridge being built from 2 different sides with the RTO technology, but I love the tree. That's a new one.
If this was Zoom, I could put that picture up. But I can't.
All right. Well, we'll leave it there. There were a couple. You can respond in the chat, and I know how to find Mr. Kessler. We can get that one answered, but I want to make sure we get to our last speaker, and then there will be time in the group discussion at the end as well at the top of the hour. So our last speaker is Rob Peterson with the California Public Utilities Commission and the Energies Division. And Rob is representing another state that did not request an extension for compliance. And so let's hear what's going on out in California. Welcome, Rob.
Yes, hi, thanks for having me. I'm an analyst in Energy Division at the California Public Utilities Commission. And as staff, I want to say thank you to Tricia for mentioning staffing. I know that as a large state, we do have a fairly large team in Energy Division. It does not feel large enough. We're planning for a high DER future grid, that kind of change. We feel understaffed even with the staff we have. So I'll start by stating that the CAISO has done amazing work, obviously, working on DERPs and DERAs and engaging with Order 2222. I believe they have very little work to do to come into full compliance. However, I personally was not part of the coordination prior to 2222 issuance. In March this year, however, our FERC and transmission planning team and Energy Division and legal team met with CAISO about next steps for the Public Utilities Commission. And my general understanding is that post 2222 issuance, we're trying to figure out still the full scope of coordination needed to ensure DERPs are successful, and especially looking at what are our near-term action items. And I have a question about that at the end of my presentation, which might be a good lead into the Q&A session. So at the moment, there aren't any DERPs or DERAs, and we may not see any meaningful participation until the CPUC completes a series of proceedings to prepare our IOU distribution system operators to fully support DERPs and DERAs. So at the CPUC, we open up new proceedings with something called an OIR, an Order Instituting Rulemaking. And we are internally deliberating now about which OIRs to open this year and early next. The scope of these OIRs is driven by asking questions to stakeholders. It's a process led by the parties and by an administrative law judge and one of our 5 commissioners. One of the questions we may be asking are which DER technologies should we focus on first to expedite DER aggregation provider success? For example, it may be that demand response and storage DER technologies are best positioned in the immediate term to help avoid summer blackout risks, which is something we're very concerned about. Other questions might be more broad, such as what policies could the CPUC adopt quickly to enable DERPs and DERAs, or even more broadly, to enable aggregators to increase the scope of services they provide to the distribution grid. So again, party-led stakeholder process, and we begin by asking questions. So I'll give an example here of how this might work out towards the end of a proceeding. In February this year, our IOUs were ordered to seek procurement of aggregations of behind-the-meter resources to defer traditional planned investments for the distribution grid. And so when they forecast a capacity need and they plan on building a new feeder, for example, an alternate way of meeting that capacity need might be an aggregation of behind-the-meter resources that that lower the overall demand of the system and avoid the upgrade need. So in any case, in February, a pilot was ordered, and we'll be deliberating in September and October about which planned investments we should target for the pilot and to see if we can procure aggregations of DERs. This pilot should help prepare our IOUs to facilitate the ability of DER aggregations to provide services to the transmission grid. The pilot will last up to 5 years, and every year we'll be selecting additional deferral opportunities. So hopefully our learnings on the distribution side will influence outcomes on the transmission side, ultimately. So I'm best positioned to speak about our Distribution Resources Plans proceeding, the DRP, and this is the proceeding related to the pilot I just described, as opposed to speaking about broadly about Order 2222, because I'm assigned to this particular proceeding as staff. So the DRP has been opened since 2014. And this summer, I anticipate we'll be considering reopening and refreshing this proceeding. 2014, prior to when I worked in this area at all, I've heard the DRP proceeding sought to open up IOU distribution planning processes for public review. They successfully made, through that proceeding, extensive amounts of data public on web-based data portals. So opening up the distribution planning process to third parties. And we established requirements at that time for grid modernization plans to be included in our IOU general rate cases. Others have brought up those grid mod plans already today. In the future, since our stakeholders are active and progressive, when we open up this proceeding, we may get questions about modifying IOU business models to support third-party DER provider access to the grid. We may get questions about wires-only utilities. Should we relook at what are monopoly and competitive functions? Those might come up. And we've been monitoring, of course, what's happened in Hawaii with performance-based rate making, and that kind of incentive, I'm sure our stakeholders will bring that up as well. And finally, when I reviewed the coordination framework section of 2222, I began thinking about the grid architecture discipline, which has been developed with support from the US DOE over the years. In fact, although I wasn't part of early stages in 2222, I'm sure grid architecture as a term must have come up. So I think it's possible we may need to step back from the specifics of purchasing grid modernization equipment in California and come to an agreement about what we want the grid to look like in 10 years. And from there, establish a vision and design principles to methodically and carefully adjust our approach to planning and operating the distribution grid. So I'm hopeful that grid architecture will come up with stakeholders in our coming process this summer. But however we proceed in California, like I said, it's driven by stakeholders. And with that, I note that the materials for today's session indicated I could ask participants a question. And I would like to ask a question, especially to those who are from the CAISO or knowledgeable about DERAs and California's electric grid. So here it is. So what policies could the CPUC adopt quickly to enable DERPs and DERAs to become successful in the near term? Where's the best place to start following CAISO's achievement of full compliance with 2222?
Awesome. Thank you, Rob, for the update and the segue question. I'm also going to invite Eric back onto the screen to kind of lead the conversation from here, which will open up to the regular EPRI participants and all the other panelists as well. If you would like to turn your cameras on and join the conversation at this point, I'll turn it over to Eric to see if he has any initial directions here.
That was great. I just wanted to thank everyone for those quick sort of overview and perspective. So one of the things we thought about doing, and I think there was a few questions during the panel overviews that might be worth kind of bringing up again across the group. But we thought about maybe having a few ISO RTO staff that might have some questions for the panel. Maybe go first for the first 10 or 15 minutes, and then maybe the second half, a few of the utilities that might have potentially different types of questions provide that. We'll see how that goes, and I think we can kind of mix and match. We don't need to necessarily stick by that. But one thing to keep in mind, it would be useful to have questions or responses. Of course, Rob had a question for folks. Maybe it can potentially respond to as well. Maybe others have responses to some of the things that the panelists say, but think about it as not a question for your particular region, but broader, because there's other opportunities, of course, that you might be speaking with folks in your own region. So maybe we'll open up with that, and we could use the raise hands feature if it gets a bit people overlapping with each other, but for now, I know we just going through the list. I know we have a lot of ISO and RTO staff on the call, in terms of some of your perspectives first in asking questions. So maybe we'll do that and see where that goes, and then we can certainly just open it up to everybody. So thinking, what are the type of things that might be useful questions for Emma? I see Kristen has her hand raised, so I'll let you go first, Kristen.
Thank you, Eric. So I had a quick question about how you are all viewing the planning process and time horizon and the kind of mismatch between DER, which can come to a region very quickly. You can see a lot of solar installers moving in and installing quite a bit of capacity in the DER area, which is very different than sort of the traditional utility planning periods and process, and what the strategies have been for your areas in dealing with that mismatch.
I'll give it a shot. This is Tricia. I'll go quick, Ted. So I think part of what Minnesota's been doing is through both electric vehicle transportation, electrification plans, as well as our IDPs, we're looking for those scenarios from our utilities on what are those potential options. And so that gives us some sort of bandwidth and evaluation in what to expect for our state. And so then we can see how that marries up with the technology that's is being implemented on our systems.
I was going to reference NARUC and NASIO did a study process that really went not directly at this question, but touched the edges of the question. Basically, what do we need to do with distribution planning for the reasons that you reference, and how does that need to be consistent with IRP process and transmission planning? So contact Danielle Sass-Burnett at NARUC. There's all kinds of resources. We had experts from all over the place, and we looked at different regional variations. If you had RTO, if you didn't, if you were retail access or weren't. So we studied the different models, and there was a whole lot of work done on that. That would be a good starting point for a deep dive on your question. Thank you.
Yeah, we in New York, we have an ongoing distribution and transmission planning process specifically designed meet our climate action goals specifically, which is a multi-layered approach. But again, it's all the context of we have statutory goals and we will meet them. And but to get there, it will require a whole lot more planning work than has been ever contemplated before on our changed grid. Ready, Marco?
Yeah, I would also add in New York, we have requirements for utilities to file distributed system implementation plans, or DSIPs, and they lay out specifically what are your forecasts for distributed resources, for EV charging, for all of those types of distributed resources that would have impact, and incorporate those into the planning process.
So I'll just speak for a state that you know, vertically integrated the old-fashioned IRP. I don't know what we're going to do. You know, we have a 3-year IRP cycle that is probably you know, completed the year before it's filed, based on data from the year before that or 2 years before that. If you're expecting some sort of tsunami in any given year of DERs, I would be the first to admit that our current processes are probably inadequate for that.
I'll just add in for Massachusetts, I think we're probably one step behind New York exploring how to do system planning that looks towards our climate goals. But one thing that we've had success with has been group study that at least allows bundles of projects to get looked at together, which helps to make sure you're kind of right sizing your infrastructure investment.
I think nothing to add from California at this point.
Thanks, Rob. Other questions for the panel? And we will open up to everyone. We don't need to go in the order I mentioned. And you know, either come off mute and ask, or you can raise the hand feature. We're not. I think we can we'll let that be flexible. You know, again, so what are some of the things that you'd like to hear from the regulator perspective, based on you know, maybe what's happening in your own discussions internally, and of course learning about how other jurisdictions that you may not be as familiar with may do things differently. I think is a good thing that we could do, given that we have this you know, broad you know, set of folks across the country. Maybe I'll ask something that that slightly similar to something I heard Tricia say as other folks are thinking about questions. What's the extent to how much staff at state PUCs participate in the ISO stakeholder meetings, and, like, you know, how many folks, or how often do you get that chance? And also, what's sort of the typical educational procedure? How do you learn about things? Is there you know, various outreach that happens? Do you attend, you know, the ISO markets training sessions, or what are some other typical you know, ways of getting some of that education of technical topics with staff?
I can jump in on this one first. I think, Marcus, you might want to speak to this too, but I think OMS does a really good job about bringing new staff on and new commissioners on with essentially an OMS training program. And so really, you know, that's one way that we get up to speed. I think there are from what I've seen, at least within the OMS sphere in our states, there's a handful from each PUC, handful of staff from each PUC that participate in the RTO process. One of my kind of ongoing concerns has been the division of those staff doing the RTO processes from the day-to-day docket work. Because now I think with FERC Order 2222 and some of the things we're seeing in this integration, they're not separate anymore. They're very much both sides really need to be understanding and aware of what's going on the other kind of side of that, maybe division or break in staff. And so I know that's something that our state is working on improving.
I can add from California's perspective. So obviously a great question, I believe, as a staff person. So there's a lot of trial by fire, definitely. And our staff participate in a lot of the working groups, the proceedings that occur. However, a lot of the IOU outreach we don't participate in, especially some of the things that have been ordered recently. Our microgrids and resiliency proceeding has resulted in an order for utilities to reach out twice a year to every county in the state on resiliency planning. And it's such a large undertaking that I don't think we can fully staff all of the work that'll be done there. And a lot of the training that goes on is mentoring based. Hopefully we have enough staff where you have a senior person and someone new and they're able to work together on projects. That's what we see the most. We do have some onboarding, and we're encouraged staff to take up training opportunities through EPRI or through whoever as much as possible. And that helps as well. But it takes at least a year, I think, to get a staff person up to date sufficiently to be fully engaged on our individual proceedings. So it's a challenge.
Michael, do you want to come off mute and ask the question and sort of clarify that you added to the chat, Michael Kessler?
Sorry, double mute. Catchphrase of 2021. Thank you. This is Michael Kessler. I'm with MISO, working as part of the DER team there. And one of the questions that we've been thinking about, particularly in light of some of the order that was language that was in Order 2222, is the role of various entities, and particularly the RTO, the State Commission, and FERC in various dispute resolution processes. And in several places, the Commission, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, seems to point to the RTO process or the FERC's own dispute resolution or complaint processes as the appropriate forum for disputes. But it seems like many of those potential disputes could arise between entities that are only subject to State Commission jurisdiction. For example, two utility distribution companies that may both feel they are impacted by DER distribution and are disputing what the appropriate cost allocation or impact may be. So I guess my general question is, sort of in light of some of those considerations, what do you perceive the appropriate role for the state commissions may be in those types of DER issues, and which entities in particular to disputes may fall within that jurisdiction? Is it only the distribution companies? Is it the aggregator? So a lot of questions mixed up there, but generally state role in dispute resolution. Thank you.
I don't have the answer to that question, but there's another level of the question that we talked about in the SPP process is, what do you do when it's an entity that nobody has jurisdiction over, or the state regulator doesn't? If it's a muni, nobody really has jurisdiction over them. So are you going to state circuit court for this kind of stuff? I think that's a really important question. Of course, the dollars involved, the policy implications involved, and the litigious nature of these things, we're going to have to answer. I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's a very important question.
I don't know case law we can necessarily give you a solid answer on what the right solution is or what's going to be coming from that.
Yeah, I'll just say, I think that it's going to be, I'm going to hope that before our compliance filing is due on before PJM's compliance filing is due on February 1st, that it's fairly clear as to what sort of disputes fall under state or PUC jurisdiction and what sort of disputes will go through the RTO's dispute resolution process. If we haven't figured that out by then, I feel like we've left something, we've left the job undone. Because I don't think that, I've heard somebody say before that once the interconnection occurs, the PUC or the PSC's job is done and they kind of lose jurisdiction on it. But I think that's the wrong way to think about it, because you're going to have ongoing issues. You're going to have things arise as there are additional interconnections on individual circuits or amongst utilities. And then when it gets into this idea of multinodal aggregations, who knows, what impacts there are going to be on particular EDCs or in particular states. And so I think that it can be clearly delineated and understood whose jurisdiction it is, but I think there's going to have to be separate but parallel dispute resolution processes.
I can add something. So I think in California, some of this is handled informally to the extent it can be. And so staff, as advisory staff, like I am in Energy Division, and depending on the type of proceeding, we're allowed to talk with different stakeholders from industry. And in that way, we can get some feedback about, for example, how the IOUs are performing on whatever order it might be a requirement. Let's say data sharing, for example. We have these data portals with data about the distribution grid. One of the tools there is an integration capacity analysis tool that's supposed to give third parties insight into where they can cite DERs with limited impact on the grid. But that data isn't always accurate or available in the way that it should be for various reasons. And so we can take that feedback and then informally ask the IOUs about it. And sometimes this may lead to official action for requirements, but sometimes it can be figured out without something formal.
To that end, we're involved in a massive data case, which basically will help standardize data platforms across all the utilities and for all the inputs. That way, because as opposed to having a hodgepodge by utility service story, make the data actually usable on many platforms, including DER developers.
Thank you for those thoughts.
Chris of FIRST Energy, I wonder if you want to come off mute for your question.
Sure. Yeah, Chris Weir, FIRST Energy. Yeah. So the question whether any of the states currently have interconnection agreements for electric vehicles or whole house battery storage systems that aren't either injecting to the grid today, but could potentially under the new FERC order. And just see how, if you do have that, how you may handle the transition, recognizing you might have allowed DER participation even outside of FERC Order 2222.
I could say so Kentucky does not have any interconnection requirements for EVs or BESS, but I think our utilities have started to try to move towards having specific tariffs that are, preferential or specific to EVs. And my expectation is as things move forward, they'll probably use folks who have taken identification of those tariffs as a way to, take that next step. And say that people have been separately metered or are these separate tariffs, whether or not they want to, start injecting into the system. But we don't have anything today.
Thank you. And another question, if we don't have anything, I'm sorry, there is one other question about disputes, retail customer and aggregator.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I don't know. This is Tomas. I don't know if Ed wanted to get off of mute to ask.
Well, I was just saying that, there's potential disputes between the retail customer, the DER owner, and the aggregator, and that dispute resolution seems to be left out of the 2222. And so does the RERA have thoughts about, where those disputes would fall?
I can attempt that one. This is Trisha from Minnesota. I know at least when you look at essentially retail customers or other kind of landowners in contracts that other your retail customers are signing that are external to the PUC, typically PUCs haven't gotten involved as a sort of like a third-party mediator. That being said, I think this might be a little bit different than some of the contracting that we've kind of historically not been a part of in the past. And we don't currently, I think, have the authority to sort of get into that relationship, but I could see longer term, not just, not saying Minnesota, but that becoming an issue depending on how kind of widespread relationships kind of are fostered or developed.
And I know there's some states in the OMS footprint that in currently working with aggregators have a process to review their qualifications and things like that. And part of that is reviewing their history working with retail customers and that sort of thing to prevent those issues and may disqualify aggregators if there are issues. And so I know that's something at least a couple of the states in the MISO footprint have taken actions on.
Marcus, this is Chris Ware. Just another question. I think I heard comments from Robert and Ted regarding kind of looking at the FERC Order 2222 and try to figure out, the key, maybe some of the key topics or the higher priorities to resolve there versus, try to implement everything at one time. And I think that's very important. We've, First Energy's footprint is in, 5 states. We have 10 operating companies. So we're kind of looking at that similar approach, and we're all in the PJM footprint, and we're having specific conversations with the folks at PJM to consider that as well. I mean, we view the FERC Order 2222 to kind of eliminate some barriers of some of these smaller units, the 100 kW minimum threshold requirements, and trying to maybe pause the thoughts of grand aggregations beyond what's currently provided in the markets, certainly with some limitations, and have folks understand the process before things are become very broad-based. And I think that's just a very, very important point to mention. And I thank you for that consideration. And honestly, what we found through the PJM process is their EDCs are at various levels of infrastructure, grid mod capabilities. Some of them have ADMS systems that are up and operational, fully functional DERM systems, capable and managing resources and kind of installing the metering and telemetry required to meet the FERC Order 2222 today and want to hit the ground running. And then there's other utilities, anywhere between that and not having an ADMS system even started. So I think you're going to see a lot of infrastructure spend from some utilities and maybe less with other utilities. And that's another key piece of this, is recognizing that we have to have flexibility in this process to meet the objectives without significant impact to customers and spend, and look at the benefits of this, the benefits of the significant spend initially, or maybe more phased in approach for hitting some of those the priority targets first.
I'll just add, I appreciate all those points. Talking about, distributed energy resources management systems, making sure that the grid modernization plans include, sufficient funding for systems like that, to the extent the utility is taking on that role as opposed to, say, an aggregator. Certainly, we're thinking about that. So yeah, some of the operational steps still need to be figured out, right? We have the highway sort of planned out for us. But just looking at the smart inverters, getting up business use cases developed and the standards necessary to operate the smart inverters so that you can dispatchable DERs, it's not set up yet. And so in our coming proceedings this year, we'll be looking at probably a new working group on smart inverter operationalization, a very tech-heavy working group, engineering specific. A lot of these details have to be ironed out before we can really see, high penetrations of DERs in the future.
I would note that's coming from California, that has significantly higher than other folks. There's kind of a curve with them at the front end of it, and some of the other states with a lot. We have one rule and has to apply to everybody, and we're just going to have to muddle our way through in terms of when are you ready for these investments? What are the levels of penetration that justify them? And I know there's a lot of study of Paul DeMartini and another fellow have studied that a lot. You know, what level of penetration justifies the investment?
There's a question here from Constantine. I know that we're running we're almost at the bottom of the hour, and I wanted to also get a perspective from folks on sort of the next steps, things like that. But Constantine, maybe I'll just ask your question for you for timing's sake. Dual participation raises a question about separating retail and wholesale transactions. Do any states have or working on establishing retail tariffs that consider separating transactions? A couple of quick responses from the panel there.
I could take that one from New York. We have demand response tariffs that all of the electric utilities have in place to provide distribution values to the utilities when they expect their peak to occur tomorrow. You know, it's summertime and you're expecting the peak to be X% of the peak load forecast. The demand response program is called, and that provides a distribution value to resources that have signed up and are receiving a reservation payment. At the same time, those same resources, which are really aggregated, there are aggregators that play in these programs and aggregate the individual resources, can take those same aggregations and play them into the ISO special case resource program, which is an ICAP value. So that way, same resources can get distribution value and also ICAP value when they are called, depending upon which program they're called upon. That's a pretty good example of a program that's in place.